it's perhaps part of the calling is that you want to have a just and fair society. And so how do you do that? And a caring and compassionate society. So just as much as it was a calling to become an educator, if you want to use those terms, I think it's also a calling to how do you serve in interest of the public. When you're in education, you're building the future.
Welcome to episode 8 of the Education Matters podcast. I'm your host, Jason Bukhari. Today, I'm honored to share a conversation with Dr. Jordan Tinney, a leader whose career has really left an indelible mark on education in British Columbia in particular, but all across Canada as well. Jordan is a recently retired superintendent of one of Canada's largest school districts in Surrey, British Columbia, serving previously on 3 other boards of education. He's worked in places large and small, rural and urban. With a PhD in curriculum, a master's in leadership, and a certified evidence-based executive coach, Jordan now serves leadership and education as a strategic consultant. With a deep interest in the complexity of leadership and ways to support effective governance, Jordan is currently working across Canada in numerous jurisdictions to support governance and leadership at the systems level. He has recently led a 2-year project to write leadership competencies for system leaders in BC, and he was an external advisor on Manitoba's rewriting of leadership standards for school leaders and co-authored a series of studies on global leadership competencies. He also has written a series of documents supporting inclusive governance for boards of education across BC. In our conversation, we learn about everything from Jordan's childhood, riding dirt bikes and motorcycles along the back roads of Victoria, British Columbia, to his love of the outdoors and biology, to his time as an oceanographic researcher on ships in the Bering Sea, and eventually to his time as a teacher and superintendent in Surrey, which under his leadership became known for its innovative approaches to assessment, digital adoption, and fostering a culture of collaboration and trust. We also discussed Jordan's thoughts on the future of learning in an ever-changing world, the importance of reconnecting students with nature, addressing systemic inequalities, technology implementations, the process of subverting the report card structure in Surrey, AI in education, advice for EdTech companies and for superintendents implementing EdTech, the challenges in dismantling oppressive system structures yet working within them, and other topics. So grab a coffee, settle in, and join me for a truly thought-provoking conversation with Dr. Jordan Tinney. Hi, Jordan. Welcome to the podcast. Where does this podcast find you today?
It finds me on the traditional unceded territories of the Okanagan Silks people in Kelowna, British Columbia, where I'm happy to live, work, play, and enjoy retirement.
Excellent, Jordan. So with that, maybe update the audience as to what keeps you busy these days.
Oh, geez. All sorts of things. I always just say the phone tends to ring. Given my background, doing lots of work in governance and strategic planning, evaluation of boards, and capacity building for principals and vice principals and senior teams. And it's very similar to the work of a superintendent, other duties as assigned. People phone and they say, Jordan, I'm trying to do this. Do you have any background in it? Do you have any expertise? And away we go. I do a lot of facilitation and still a lot of executive coaching and just, whatever people need on the moment.
Well, that all sounds fascinating. Hopefully we can dive into it. As someone who's really been, in my eyes, and I think, this has also resonated from other folks, one of the most respected people in K-12 education, certainly in BC, but I would say throughout Canada. I do want to get your perspective on the life of a superintendent, your view of schools, current, we can even say past, currently, and then in the future. But I'd love to give the audience always a sense of who my guests are as human beings. So I would love to start, Jordan, with the question, where and when did you grow up?
Oh, well, mostly grew up, of course, in British Columbia, Vancouver Island mostly. I did some time in the interior up by 100 Mile House, but generally in pretty small communities. My early school years were in Port Alberni, over by Tofino and Pacific Rim National Park, but and then my kind of youth and the middle years were in a logging camp community on northern Vancouver Island, a place called Was Camp, which is a very tiny, about 280 people. My graduating class was 20 kids, and that was from about 3 or 4 different communities.
Mm,
So tiny places, and mostly on Vancouver Island, and influenced greatly by my father and his family, all of who had an education background.
interesting. Very interesting. So, how did kids such as yourself play on Vancouver Island in those days?
Well, I think you go back to my father. He grew up in a tiny place in Carcross in the Yukon, where it was all about the outdoors. You can imagine Carcross in probably the 30s, 40s, 50s, rural Yukon, just outside of Whitehorse, and what it was like. So, my early times were out fishing with my dad and jigging for cod and fly fishing, and you know he loved the outdoors, so anything that related to biology and plants and birds, it was the outdoors was your oyster, and that's what you did. And then when I got into Port Alberni and started getting deeply involved into sports and played all sorts of sports, my love was soccer and still remains this day. Played a lot of volleyball, and then when I was in Was, it probably fit the bill. There were you're in a logging camp and you can make a little bit of money, and then the nearest police station was probably 70 miles away, 70 kilometers, I guess it would be in those days, in Port McNeill. So bought myself a motorcycle and just rode the hills wherever you could go, just endless logging roads. So my good friend and I, that's what we did. I mean, it's nice to have a couple people, so if you ever break down out there, you're not alone. But you can imagine being completely free in the outdoors with a few motorcycles and just 15, 16, 17 years old, and away you go.
Is there anything about that kind of upbringing that you wish children today could experience?
Well, it has its own incredible freedom, and of course, with freedom comes responsibility. Like, stuff happens. You wipe out there, and you got to get back, and you make some decisions that you might regret, and the consequences are immediate, sometimes very substantial. So, probably a thread throughout we talked today. I wish kids today could have more of a connection with the outdoors, but that's very, very difficult, particularly in an urban setting, right? Where I grew up, it wasn't, you wouldn't have to walk 5 minutes before you were deep in the trees, and that was it. There was no one there. But try to do that in downtown Toronto, or Vancouver or Montreal or places like that. So this whole connection with nature and the environment is more difficult, but probably more essential than ever.
So, can you tell me a little bit about your education? What aspects of your early education stand out to you?
I think it's the same sort of thread, freedom and experiential. I didn't go to kindergarten, despite the fact that my father was the teacher in the public school, which would have been Alert Bay at that time.
Mm.
I can remember one of my early memories was I got out the hose and I sprayed all the kids as they went into kindergarten to try and stop them from going to kindergarten because I wanted to play. So I got in trouble for that. But, it being completely experiential, like, to give you examples, things that I loved, biology, insects. I loved insects. So I'd go out and collect insects and I would categorize them and have a pin board in my house and make a wall of insects and classify them and learn the plants and the birds, and just I loved learning from the environment and learning about, well, what is this world in which we live, and how are we compatible and things like that. So early education was just a lot of fun. It was all about connecting with life.
Was that love of biology one of the first things you remember loving to learn?
Yeah, probably. I mean, many boys early, who knows, maybe girls probably as well. I love bugs, and I used to
Mm.
just gather them all up, and then I wanted to know what it was. And my father, being who he was, he's like, okay, well, let's get a cork board and let's put it in your room and let's make that the wall. And do you know how insects are classified? And do you know the structure of an insect? And do you know the Latin of the names? Like, do you know Lepidoptera, the
Mm.
butterflies and moths? It means scale wings. So we get out a microscope and you look at the wings and you look at the scales, and it was just like that. So just loving to learn from the things were of interest to you, right? There are lots of things I didn't have an interest in, but for the things that you had an interest in, full bore and go deep. Yeah, and that stayed with me for years. I always thought I'd be a marine biologist because I love diving as well, and I
Mm.
really thought that's the way I would go.
When you reflect back on how your father raised you, mother and father raised you, in terms of how they promoted or um, kind of discussed your education, what do you remember?
Yeah, that's a good question because I don't think they ever um, promoted or discussed. It just was a way of being. I mean,
Mm.
my father's upbringing in Carcross was his father went up to Carcross to be a teacher, and I don't know how much he knew at the time of what the situation he would land himself in, but he landed in Chutla Residential School. And when he got to
Mm.
the residential school and started to teach, and this is probably very much a very politically active family I have. My grandfather said, this doesn't work. This doesn't work for kids. It doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for the community. I'm out. And yet he
Mm.
had a family of three boys and a girl and a wife. And so what did he do? He found out that he could start a public school if he could gather 8 kids. That was the bar. So between his children and children that he could coax out of the residential school, he started
Mm.
a school in his house. And
Mm.
so you can imagine, and then it grew from there, literally into he coaxed many children out of the residential school, and the pictures I've seen are, probably easily, enrollment of 30 or 40 kids. But you can imagine my
Mm.
father being raised literally in a school, and what would you have? You'd have the environment around you. So our home, that's the way it was. Life was about learning, and learning was life. It's just the way it is.
So you are a third generation teacher.
I don't know if my grandfather's grandfather was a teacher. I don't think so. He was a farmer
Mm.
in England and in Somerset. So yeah, there's lots of teachers in the family. Everybody, my dad begged me not to teach because he wanted something different. He's like, come on, everybody's a teacher. You gotta do something different. That's how I ended up in electronics because they thought, oh, okay, well, not another teacher, but yeah, our kitchen table was, principals, vice principals, union parent or union presidents, pack presidents, music teachers. Uh, everybody was, everybody had a piece of the pie.
Yeah, when you say electronics, tell me about that story.
Well, so when I got out of school, Dad said, just come on, try something different. And so he said to me, to date myself, those computers, I think there's might be something in those. Go do that. So I
Hmm.
went into electronics engineering and went to school and got a career in oceanography, where I helped basically oceanographic measurement and atmospheric measurement. And so I programmed and calibrated electronics of measurement instruments, both again ocean and atmosphere, for about 7 years, and worked in places like in the Bering Sea, out on ships, and in Cold Lake and Suffield, Alberta, doing what they would call watching the atmosphere for drift. So almost thinking of biological weaponry and protecting against that. But
Hmm.
what I really ended up doing was traveling around Canada and the world, teaching people in universities how to do measurement and calibration. And so
Hmm.
all of my experience of that, we're sitting in like Burlington, the Center for Inland Waters, sitting in Burlington and working with people about in a wave pool, how do you measure the flow of water and tidal and current. And so I just found myself teaching. So when I thought at the end of the day, well, I'm teaching anyway, I should just go back. So I went back to university and pursued a career in education. And because of my background in electronics, I was I was probably an attractive package at that day because I've been in electronics engineering, worked as a programmer, lots of familiarity with computers. It didn't matter what platform, and networking and setting up networks. And so at that time, that was just booming in education. And so that's
Yeah.
was kind of an interesting entry point for me.
So how old were you when you went back into education to become a formal teacher?
Yeah, I was 30.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's fascinating. One of my let's call it pet theories is that every teacher would be better served doing something even for a few years before becoming a teacher, just to understand, I think, how awesome the profession is in general, but also to get some different experience and to break up that same schedule you've been on since childhood of starting in September, ending in June, and just seeing something different. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big world out there, right? I think that,
Mm-hmm.
like having worked in private industry and seeing what, the importance of a bottom line and profit, and
Mm-hmm.
that being employment, and working in a small company. Our company was very small. It was an international company. We had offices in Victoria and Boston and Bergen, Norway, but we were still a fairly small operation. But knowing what it meant to go out and actually market and sell things, and that you had to turn a profit, and that the economy mattered, um, and you were in competition with people, and there were other people who had good products that were in some way superior. The products we had, to give you an example, when Doppler and acoustics came out for measuring ocean current, at the time we were deploying a thread of instruments, so maybe say 30 or 40 instruments in a chain. So that's 30 or 40 units that we're selling. And out comes Doppler acoustics, and it just sits on the bottom of the boat and just goes flash and takes the entire column in one shot. And you're like, okay, that's a game changer.
Mm-hmm.
And so you learn about technology, but the ability to experience a different world, and also you gain a complete different respect for people. Like when I go to conferences now, I've stood in those booths and chatted with people and tried to tell them, why that we were a good thing for them. And I've lived that world,
Mm.
and I've had my bags packed and been told, hey, you're going to the Bering Sea for 2 weeks aboard a ship, get going. And, so to experience, a difference in your life, and to see people in different ways is fantastic. And I think it contributes overall. I can remember being asked by one of our guys who worked with us in oceanography. His name was Dennis, and he went off to teaching. And he said, Jordan, you're all families teachers. Why aren't you becoming a teacher? And I said to him, it's too much work. Because teaching is not an easy profession. So anyway, roundabout way in your question, I think anything you can do to experience other professions, other aspects, you can learn so much. I have a daughter and a son, and right now my son is transitioning into university, and his first summer of work was with wrenches and grease, and he's learned so much in a summer. And one of the things he learned is, yeah, I want to go to school, because there are some things I don't want to do for 40 years.
Yeah, well, when my dad was worried about me and whether I'd be interested in school or not, he sent me to work with an uncle in a pasta factory. I quickly appreciated school a whole lot more. One more question about this kind of family inheritance. Do you believe teaching's a calling? I've taught for many years, and now having been out for many years, I still hear that inner voice and that desire to teach. I'm still scared by the amount of work that it is, but I kind of feel to some degree it's a calling that folks, I think, need to listen to more.
Well, I would ask you in return, so what about your family? Is there a thread in teaching in the family?
Oh, yeah, everybody. I'm the black sheep that went into education technology. Two sisters that are
Yeah.
teachers, mom teacher, dad teacher.
Yeah, so I think, to answer that, I think family plays a huge role in how you set up your future. How many doctors have you met where their parents were doctors? Or how many
Mm-hmm.
lawyers you met where their parents were lawyers? So I think you grew up knowing the things you know, and it's also it's visceral to you. Like I knew what teaching looked like. I knew.
Mm-hmm.
I spent Sunday nights and Monday nights and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday with my dad in those days, watching him do the homework and marking and the Gestetner, and help them go up to school and run them off and hand them. So I knew what the cadence of work of teaching looked like. And so I think there is a calling for wanting to be part of a social fabric of society. I think teaching is probably, I'll throw this out there as well, highly political. I think that it's perhaps part of the calling is that you want to have a just and fair society. And so, how do you
Mm-hmm.
do that? And a caring and compassionate society. So, just as much as it was a calling to become an educator, if you want to use those terms, I think it's also a calling to how do you serve in interest of the public? And there are only so many professions that do that. Oceanography wasn't, it was really hard to see the direct link to serving the public, getting better gas for the gas tank. But when you're in education, you're building the future. You really feel that. And I'm sure it's the same in healthcare, where I can see even police and social services and things like that, and elderly care and early learning. So I think it is about wanting to serve.
Yeah, and I think that's a great message for any teachers listening, because I think sometimes it can be, like many of the professions you just listed, can be somewhat thankless. We all have that story of that great teacher that impacted our life, except we don't usually realize that till years later. And so you lose connection with that teacher, and they often don't get thanked, although it does happen from time to time. Um, so, given either your experience, growing up in, rural BC, or your experience teaching, or your experience as a superintendent, can you describe some of the most inspiring things you've seen in education?
Um, yeah, I think to see how much people care, like just, I think about students. I met a student once. One of the challenges I had when I went to secondary school was I struggle with awards, to give you an example. Like, everybody gets
Mm,
upstage and you almost know who's going to get the awards. Like you could have picked them 3 years ago, right?
mm-hmm,
And yet, in amongst all of that, I saw students who were doing amazing things given the context in which they lived, and they never got honored. And so I think the inspiration was watching kind of the not the top 2 and 3%, um, but way more the other kids who were overcoming extreme obstacles and doing really well, and in some case doing it completely silently.
mm,
They're just going along. They've found that the system is working. They've got it figured out, and meanwhile they're going home and they're couch surfing or and working 2 jobs. Those were the things that were inspiring.
mm-hmm.
So, and to see students who have learning disabilities um, and our diverse abilities and doing tremendous work, and knowing that they got what they needed to be successful.
What, in your opinion, in all the classrooms you've been in over the years, what do the best classrooms look like, sound like, feel like?
Oh, I would just say, given what I just said to you early, look out your window. There it is, right? Like education isn't something that happens between 4 walls. It happens when you interface with your surroundings and the environment. And yes, you can interface with a book, and you can interface in new ways with technology, but um, in schools, you just think about your average secondary school. How much education occurs in the hallways and around the locker and in the parking lot as
Mm,
opposed to the classroom? You're learning content in the classroom, and you're learning processes, and which are all extremely valuable. But in order to survive in society, you have to be able to get along, figure it out, and fit in and find out who you are and what you want to do. So the social settings and the group dynamics are absolutely just essential. So when you say, what does the best classroom look, sound, and feel like more open, more recognizing the importance of social settings, um, giving opportunities for students to find out who they are and what they want to experience, and to get down to the instructional level and accessible. I would say many of the classrooms that we have today are not actually accessible to kids. We may think they're accessible, but they're not. Even where kids sit, you know, um, you watch even in adult settings, you go into a room, people will immediately look for where to sit. Where do I find my place where I fit in this room? And I think that's just natural, being social beings. But the other part is any classroom should have a way where students feel that they're welcomed and that they have access. And I think sometimes that's not the case. And that's not saying teachers are doing bad things. I think teachers do magical things, but the structures of the institutions that we have, by their very nature, put kids in boxes and put numbers on doors and courses and say, sit here. And boy, if you haven't done these prerequisites, you're not ready for my course. That sometimes happens.
For sure. And I definitely want to talk to you a little bit more about the structure, the inherited structure, and how you see that, morphing one way or the other for good or for ill. But before we get there, you mentioned, some of the magic that you've seen teachers or have experienced teachers bring to the classroom. What are the qualities you most admire in great teachers? And feel free to extend that to support staff or principals as well.
Yeah, I'd just say, it doesn't have to be teachers. It's a great. So using teacher in the context of, I believe everyone's a teacher, regardless of your role, right? Great teachers don't teach curriculum; they teach themselves, right? The things I admire most about people, being real, vulnerable, able to connect with each other and students and adults, and somehow these people, show you that they care and they have a sense of interest in you, and interest in others, and interest in the world. So I would say it's a given that they know their content. I mean, these are people who are professionals, right? They have degrees in these things. It's all of the other stuff around the edge that are the qualities that make greatness. I've never met a teacher yet that I thought was great because of their content knowledge. I know people who have exceptional content knowledge, and I know people who have exceptional content knowledge and are not great teachers. And I know people who have exceptional content knowledge and are amazing teachers. So what's the difference? And the difference is how they interface with students, their environment, and and make the learning fun. Like, learning shouldn't be a hurdle. It should be a challenge, but learning should be an accomplishment, something to enjoy, something to relish, and something to really be excited about.
Yeah. So now if we turn to that structure piece and that question, a lot of people don't have the fondest memories of school, especially, let's say in the era between, you and I, let's say between, the 70s and the 90s, very kind of structured, disciplinary. You've been a superintendent for quite a while of the largest district in BC. How challenging is it to change the system?
Oh yeah, it's incredibly tough. One of my most favorite sonnets is Ozymandias. So if you ever get a chance, I think it's Percy by Shelley, but it's I think of the system as literally you have to go read the sonnet to get the poem. Basically, it's imagine building this huge statue of this giant behemoth that is a commander in chief in the middle of the desert, but over time the desert just wears him down and smashes the statue. But schools, the reason I say it, schools are incredibly resilient. They are like a super tanker. Like, if you go into a system thinking you're going to change it tomorrow, heads up, it's not that easy. But you can make an enormous difference. But you have to start with where the system is, right? So you can make an enormous change in culture, in the way people relate, in how decisions are made, in things like transparency, in dismantling the hierarchy, yet while accepting your roles and responsibilities in it. I thought, for many people, there I give them where I give advice. I say, look, collaboration is fantastic. Collaboration is critical to effective decision making, but you're hired to make a decision. Go do your job.
Hmm.
Like, get on with it. But it means go through processes where people feel they have opportunities to be part of it and be connected and to feel like they're part of the system, and then make the call, because the worst thing you can do is not make the call and continue to consult, for another year. So I think
Hmm.
you changing culture, like if you want to change a system, you have to change the culture. Otherwise it'll just snap right back,
Hmm.
to the place that it was. And remember that as a school superintendent, you are just the latest in a long line, right? It
Hmm.
isn't about you. For many of the teachers and people, the adults in the system, the trustees in the system, some of them will have been there for 30 years. You'll be their eighth or ninth superintendent.
Hmm.
So it isn't about just Jordan, the superintendent. It's about the role superintendent, and what about the next person who steps into the role? And how can we sustain some of the good things and continue to sustain some of the changes that we want to make?
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, it's not surprising at all that you talk about the culture and what you created in Surrey, because, as our common friend Dean Shareski and I have always pointed out, it always felt like there was a special culture in Surrey. Can you give the audience a sense of, maybe some of the initiatives that you're most proud of, or your role in perpetuating or building that culture in Surrey?
Yeah, I think, when I came to Surrey, I come from a small place. I'll go back actually to my transition into Vancouver,
Hmm.
because remember again, the town I grew up is like 200 kids. And when I was
Mhm.
superintendent in Comox Valley, it's only 8,000 kids.
Hmm.
And when I got to Vancouver, they brought me over to do some specific initiatives with the board and in the district. And they would sit me down and they'd say, "Hey, Jordan, we just want to tell you how, this works. Like, how do we do projections, or how do we do this and that?" And I thought about them. Wait a minute, don't you understand that I did all those things in Comox Valley? So when you're in small places, you do everything.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then when you're in big places, you're now managing whole teams, right? And so when I first came into Surrey, the piece I thought is, well, how do I make a big place seem small? So I tried to be accessible, tried to be there for people, let them know who the superintendent was. And I came from a district where I would, on opening day, I would visit every school. And then you get to Surrey and like, okay, if I visit every school, if I could possibly do it, it would probably take me 2 years, to get there. But so how do you make a big place small? And then through that, the other part, I'll go back to the political activism piece.
Hmm.
I always felt like a good superintendent or a good leader is a supportive subversive, meaning
Hmm.
you are connected and you're supportive of the overall direction of education, but you're constantly looking at ways that you can make a substantial change. And I think one of the ways that we made a substantial change, I think about our work in digital portfolios.
Hmm.
And it actually, to me, had nothing to do with should we go to digital portfolios versus standard report cards or not. But the impetus of that was, I said to teachers and to the system, report cards are killing people. Like, you look at absenteeism around report card time, and it's crazy. We
Hmm.
know people book off sick, they use their sick time so that they can write report cards,
Hmm.
and they do it in huge numbers. And so, what is it about report cards that are causing this? And could we do something different? So I said to them, look, um, at the time, hey, how about something completely different, like a digital portfolio? What I said is, if you are willing to experiment with us in this, um, we'll have your back. So we will challenge the ministerial order on reporting, and we will support you in doing something that might not be consistent with a ministerial order. But at the same time, we're having very positive conversation with the ministry saying they too want to go in a different direction. They don't know what it looks like. So no surprises. I'm not trying to kneecap anybody, but I'm trying to demonstrate that we could do something different. And how could we do that in a way that was supportive of the ministry, supportive of our school district, and yet really tried something innovative? So when I say that was inspiring work, I give that background because I can remember sitting around tables with teachers and listening to them talk about what reporting meant to them and what assessment meant to them. They were some of the most inspiring conversations ever because people were questioning their work at its absolute grassroots level. Why do I do a spelling test? And why do I mark it? And why is it important to me? And what does it have to do with literacy? And things like that. And it's not for work on spelling tests, but when I listened to the conversations teachers were having, it was unbelievable. And it was so inspiring to hear them thinking about the very core of their work and what was of value to them and value to their students. I think the other part I would say was, inspiring. It was our recreation of the vision for learning. I used to think, I did a vision for learning one day in the middle school, and we took an afternoon and we wrote a vision for the middle school, and that was that. Well, the one we did in Surrey has a long history and background, and it was more, I'll say, a revision and refinement. But it took us 18 months to do, and in the end of the day, it still stands the test of time. I believe about being, this, learning by design. That comes back to the belief that teachers are the designers of engaging learning environments, teaching as craft. And so I think the process of creation of the vision and how it continues to resonate for the system, and I think how it became lightning rod is probably overstating it, but a real sense of coherence for what are we trying to do for kids and how are we empowering teachers overall. Like the learning structures tool part, to give you again a flavor of the support of Subversive, we said on the structures part, we want you to challenge and break the structures that you feel don't work for kids and for you, and we will support you in that. And on the tools part, hey, tools don't have to be the latest digital tool. There are lots of things which make a quality education. So those are just a couple things, Jason, that come to mind.
Well, I absolutely love that idea of supporting the subversive. I feel that one of the biggest things that we need to challenge is kind of like the disposition of people who become teachers. And I'll speak with my family. Like my sister is one of the most compliant human beings you'll ever meet. She doesn't want to ruffle feathers, but she also knows that she feels constrained by, say, the curriculum at times. And I often tell her, it's like, you have one of the most powerful unions in the history of unions. You can push your practice a little bit. So I love that at the top level, you encourage that questioning of traditional practice. But I want to come back a bit to the work you did around assessment and portfolios, because I really believe that, report cards are the best example of the emperor's new clothes. Like the emperor is naked. He's been naked forever and no one's, calling it out. But I know you did a lot of great work there in, moving that ball forward, so to speak. How did it end up by the time you retired, and what do you think that trajectory still looks like?
Specifically to the digital portfolio piece?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, again, I also said to people all along, this isn't about digital portfolios. This is about challenging assessment, evaluation, and reporting practices. So don't think this is us buying the next shiny bauble and putting it in your hands. So I also said to them, look, in the EdTech world, companies come and go and get swallowed up and changed and morphed. And so we need to be prepared that this is about quality instruction and assessment and what works for teachers and kids, not about a tool or a piece of software. So it's had its own evolution. I also am a big strong proponent of people need choice and flexibility. So we end up in a world at the end of the day where we have choice and flexibility for people, and people can choose what works for them. Because back to kind of my leadership style is not one of saying, here's the dictate, thou shalt. Like, I just don't feel that ever goes well. So wherever I can, try to work with people so that they have choice. Because some people, you take your sister as an example, some people need the comfort of tradition. It's too much for them to do something radically different. It's too much work. It's too much time. It's just, they're trying to manage their own world as they have it. And they can only accept so much disruption. So you don't want to break them, right? So give people options within their career and life to choose, a level of change that works for them.
So with that work, I remember you telling me fairly early on that you were, changing to a more portfolio-based assessment practice, but that the higher ed institutions around you were like, hang on a second, we have no basis to kind of use this portfolio as a way to accept students. Like, they have their own administrative structure, and obviously grade point average, report cards are a lot more scalable in terms of, assessing a student's, capacity to go to, higher education. How did that work end off? Where is that now from the best of your knowledge?
Yeah, complicated piece for sure. Kwantlen Polytechnic University, under the leadership of David Burns, Dr. David Burns, did a project with Surrey on portfolio entrance to post-secondary. And it was tremendously successful. What he did was he mapped out the competencies that students are learning in K to 12 and demonstrated through portfolio how those competencies have already met the university requirements. And there were a number of students that went through portfolios and got accepted into universities. And there are other universities that have portfolio projects or acceptance. But, there is another whole part, back to the Ozymandias piece, is universities are their own machine. And you said demonstrate, I think, the abilities or the qualities to be successful in post-secondary education. They need a sorting mechanism. And grade point is the great sorting mechanism. And if you want to get me going, mathematics is the great sorting mechanism. Success in mathematics. And so they have no other vehicle to process tens of thousands of applicants. So, and they're unable, I wouldn't say unwilling. It's a big difference when you think back to even the concept of report cards. To sit with a group, you can imagine also the diversity of post-secondary. We say post-secondary and we think, Queens or, UBC or something like that, U of T. Okay, these are enormous institutions, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other smaller post-secondary institutions which use the same vehicles for entrance. So you're talking about changing an entire industry that has a business model that is working well for them. Universities are not broke. And looking at you go to UBC and you look at the resources they're sitting on and what they're doing. Their business model works for them. So that, what is the impetus for change? So I think until you can actually generate a sense of urgency about the need for something completely different, the machine works for them. It's a sorting mechanism that gives them the students they want. And, you read the letters that students receive when they're being given entrance. And I can say as a parent, I was thrilled to receive one of those letters from my son. You have demonstrated A, B, C to meet the bar that is, demonstrative of or indicative of the quality of the learner that gets into Oxford or something like that. Like it's its own merit machine. So in terms of where is a conversation about different entrants, where does that exist right now? I would say it's very small and very limited because the business machine and model that is post-secondary institution or entrance, particularly for these large research universities, is well honed, well refined, and is overwhelmed with the number of applicants.
I mean, I think that's all true, but where I would push back a bit is I'm not so sure that the model is working as well as it did for the last 20, 30 years. I know our friends to the south in the US are really starting to see the cracks in the system. Obviously, in Canada, it's a bit different that we have more, public funding to keep costs down. But that's changing. And I think, the threat from the Googles of the world, the Metas of the world that are out in the open trying to circumvent university degrees, mainly because in the US they're so expensive. But having said all that, I do think this is one of the great opportunities for AI and AI assessment. I know there's challenges there and a lot to think about, but I think there's an opportunity there. Do you have any thoughts on how something like generative AI can help with assessment and streamline, maybe portfolios or oral assessment, things like that?
Oh, I think AI can be an absolute game changer around assessment. I've done some tootling around myself and still use it almost every day for different aspects, but its ability is growing and growing so fast. I think, again, I go back to the teacher workload and marking piece. I think there is an enormous opportunity there for AI's role in marking. The challenge will be, at what point does that become a threat to the teacher's work and quality control? Like, how do you actually ensure? But I believe both of those can be overcome. I believe that it has the ability to be a game changer for assessment and evaluation and reporting. But the danger, of course, is how do you do that in a way that still keeps the human component, right? Because AI certainly, at least in my experience right now, is not always right, but it certainly has a role to play, and I think could be enormous.
Yeah, my instincts tell me you just mentioned, I think, something that should be the key tenet of AI in education. It can be used and should be used only insofar as that it enhances the human dynamic of teaching. So any of these ideas of emotionally intelligent AI robots to put in front of your kids, I don't know if you've seen some of those prototypes that are out there and things like that, but to me, that is absolutely horrifying and not the way we should be going. Like the idea of replacing teachers with AI, I don't think should ever be even experimented with.
No, and I don't think that would be good for society. But the other part, when you say keeping it human, remember that humans are biased. And there is a piece where we actually need to take the human out of education, particularly around evaluation. We know that there's research out there that who a student is plays a role in the mark they get. And I've experienced in my work with AI doing summaries of documents and feedback that I have put my own bias into a particular analysis of a set of text, and AI has said back to me that it has a slightly different one, and it's had me questioning my own judgment around, oh, gee, did I really give that person a fair shake? And so I think that AI has the ability to keep the human point, but perhaps increase the objectivity in some cases so that the equity piece can retain can stand in the forefront. But yeah, see, having robots in the front, remember back to my comment, great teachers teach themselves. They don't teach content. Any robot can blaze any teacher on content, but it's still not a human being. It can fake it, but it just doesn't make it.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point for both aspects there. So since we're on the topic of AI, Jordan, and I know you've been involved with many digital adoptions, from portfolios to instructional resources. Can you give any kind of advice? And let's look at this in both ways. Can you give any advice for superintendents as to how to partner with EdTech organizations? Because it does seem like it's going to be increasingly important to do so. And then the flip side of that, what advice would you give EdTech companies on partnering with school districts?
Yeah, I'll probably say this with a bit of caution, but I think there are some superintendents that want to partner with EdTech companies because it raises their profile as a superintendent. that I'm a partner with A, B, or C, and I'm going to implement this big initiative, and it's going to make. So I'd say one of the first things that superintendents have to do when partnering with EdTech companies is make sure it's not about them. And I'm not trying to be pejorative, or there's lots like that. I just think sometimes I see people who champion specific um, electronic initiatives or
Mm.
EdTech initiatives, and I'm not sure it's the best thing for kids. But I watched, and maybe it's kind of a reciprocal relation. I watch them both champion the company or the product, and the company or the product champion them. And I think
Mhm.
that does a disservice to educate and to both partners. It really does, because these can be good products and good initiatives. They absolutely can. Um, I would say so for the superintendent, it has to be about, why is this good? What is it really going to change? And how is it going to be better for kids? And not about your public profile.
Mm.
Like I went to a district once specifically to see them because at that time the big thing was let's go 1-to-1. And they had gone 1-to-1. And this was a big deal. There was a lot of um, promotion around this and advertisement around this. And in the end of the day, I wasn't convinced that the learning was any better.
Mm.
But good for them for trying. Everything's a work in process. But I just wasn't convinced at the end of the day that it was the best things for kids. But I think that they had an interesting evolution there themselves, and that it did get better over time, and certainly good for them again for trying something important. But I would say if you want for the ed tech companies, come with a relationship piece first. Learn
Mm.
about our business, come to understand us as a district or as an organization. Our challenges, our opportunities, and don't come in assuming that your latest gadget or innovation will revolutionize our work, because we
Mm.
both know it won't. Like
Mm.
it just won't. And we do need new tools, right? We do want innovation, um, but the curriculum, and the social challenges, it's a full plate already. And
Mhm.
so, what is it about the reason to partner with you that will make our work more rewarding? And I specifically would say not easier, because it isn't, because people will work hard if they know it's rewarding.
Mhm.
It isn't about making your job easier, it's about making the work you do more rewarding. I mean, people talk to me lots of time about, gee, Jordan, what's it like to be in a superintendent in a district of 80 and a district of 8? And I say to them, I when I was a vice principal in a middle school, I probably worked the same hours that I worked as superintendent. Like you can only work so many hours. The work is completely different.
Mm.
So people find their own cadence of the work. And, to go back to the vice principal example, I could lay awake worried all night about a child who, didn't have food and wasn't succeeding in school and was making teachers angry, and they wanted them out of there. And as superintendent, I can worry about whole systems like that. But what I'm saying is, I think people work hard,
Mm.
and what they want to feel is that their job is more rewarding, because sometimes when you're working hard it can feel like you're making no progress. So how can you demonstrate that being part of an innovation or part of something new or part of a challenging, in a good way, like I mean challenging our assumptions of belief, partnership, can make the work better and more
Mm.
fun?
Mm. I love that. I'm going to ask you to expand on that a bit because, as you know, I've worked with very large organizations, and increasingly so, I'm working with a lot of startups that have a lot of great merit in the resources that they're developing. But everybody thinks their product is the greatest product, the greatest innovation. And maybe they have to believe that in order to
Yep.
spend all that
Yep.
time, that risk to themselves personally and professionally to do that. But what advice would you give them on that relationship piece? What's the best way to go about that?
Go talk to teachers. Like if you've got, let's say you've got some ed tech product that is about early literacy, like just to pick that. Fine, go into a school district and ask if you can have, a meeting, a dinner meeting, offer food does a lot of wonderful things. Offer dinner for a dozen, really solid early literacy teachers, and talk to them about their work, and talk to them about their needs, and talk to them about what do they actually want and what would help, and find out if your product actually can do that. Like, start with where people are, not with where you think they should be. It's like someone walking up, you're walking down the street and someone walks up to you with a brochure and says, "Can I just stop you for 5 minutes? Can they believe your life would be better if you did what they want you to do. But you're just going to the coffee shop. You don't want to stop for like,
So pay for the coffee and then say, "Hey, this might help you out a bit."
Yeah. Gee, I heard you speaking about this, over your coffee. I'm curious to learn more about that. But get to know the people. And everyone would say relationships matter, but I mean relationships. Understand people's work, understand the pressures that they have, and then figure out whether or not what you have can actually help them. Because remember that whatever you have, even if it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, is more work for them. There is nothing that is less work, because the adoption of any innovation requires work, emotional work, physical work. It also requires letting go of a past. If you talk about the William Bridges model of transitions, you have to let go of a past in order to accept a new future. So that means anxiety, grief, anger, So unless you're dealing with literally some sort of critical urgency, which happens sometimes in the software world, right? Hey, that company's gone. They're no longer supporting it. That happens all the time in software. We need to move. So unless you're faced something like that, the ability to have people move to something is a really big ask.
Yeah, and I'll say in our shared experience in Surrey, one of the great things I was ever part of is the day of learning that we did at the onset of the school year, where you graciously provided dinner for everyone, and me and my team provided a whole bunch of learning, and it was just a great relational way to get to know the teachers, them to get to know what we were doing. And I thought, if this can happen 10 times a year across all the different things, which I'm sure you did on your end, it would be just an amazing way to also thank the teachers. I think teachers spend so much time learning new resources or adopting new resources or learning new practices that goes way above and beyond. So feeding them and treating them to that kind of experience is just a great way to go about it.
Yeah, well, learning is an individual and a social process. So when you put people together, great learning happens.
So on that note, Jordan, if I can ask you to look forward, you are, I think it's safe to say, the end of your career, although you're doing so many new and interesting things, but the end of your career as a, person part of the system. If you look, to a time when you and I are not going to be here anymore unless, some AGI develops some exoskeleton that our brains can live in. And I don't know if either of us would want to do that. But if you look, say, 50 years into the future, what do you see education looking like?
Yeah, well, I think the good, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think the good doesn't change. Caring people, flexible curriculum, a lack of top-down data-driven accountability, but still providing public assurance, but that does no harm. Graduating students who have a sense of confidence, identity, optimism, and then a network of support. I think that at the end of the day, 50 years out, if you're doing that, you still probably have a pretty good system. I think about other goods. The integration of services. I just don't see us being able to continue to afford the silos we have of social services, health and education. Like, things are just way too expensive. We were paying when I left, $5 million an acre in Surrey for land. Like, the cost of building a secondary school is approaching $250 million with land. Like, that's just insane. Right. So building a college here and a public library there and a school over there, it's simply becoming, at what point is that simply untenable? And so somehow there has to be an economy of scale, and a way to reduce, transitions between these services, because school system itself, K to 12, is being far more about social services as well. And so how do we integrate those things, in a more meaningful way? And I know it's done all over the place. It's just, the mechanisms haven't been there. To use the post-secondary example, there are, of course, K to 12 schools which have a post-secondary institution attached to them, but to make those things work, you need policy changes, significant policy changes, so that it's in everyone's interest to co-develop. The good, the bad, and the ugly. The bad, overworked, overstressed people, complex curriculum driven by high stakes accountability, designed to keep the system in check. I think we will always be faced with this political need to, we're spending billions and billions, of dollars on education. Are we doing a good job? And somehow those accountability systems need to find a way to answer that question, without really driving the system. Bad, graduating students who are unprepared for the future and have no vision for a positive future. Like, I think there is a new need for us to have some, to use Barack Obama's words, hope and audacity, the audacity of hope. Like, we have to have hope for today's kids. Neither you nor I, Jason, I'm sure, given our ages, looked at, gee, I want to go buy a house, and we saw a 7-figure number, right? Which is just crazy right now. So how do you have hope? The ugly, I would say the good, the bad, the ugly, the same system we have now, but not responding to the changing needs of the future. Just the machine continues and it just doesn't change.
Well, I think that's a wonderful answer, but I want to kind of poke at that intimation you had of a utopian future. So if I gave you a magic wand and you can do anything to education to improve it, to make it that ideal version of education that Jordan Tinney has in his head, what would you do? What are the key things that you would use that magic wand for?
Well, I think, and maybe, we all go back to the things we liked, I would say in a moment's notice, the ability to respond to the teachable moment. Like, I find the curriculum, people feel very curriculum driven these days. The walls would come down. It doesn't mean there isn't a time to sit in a seat, but, outdoors plays a really big role. What do you think about climate change and us not being in touch with the future of our planet and what's happening? You watch Florida right now coming on when the second hurricane in however many days, and they're saying, gee, the incredibly warm ocean, and it hasn't been like this in 50 years, and we've seen that picture too many times, right? But people are dying, and hundreds of billions of dollars are being spent trying to mop up. So how do we remain in touch or get in touch with the outdoors and the environment in a way that we start to address these enormous challenges? You think about the complexity of that challenge, right, on a global scale. I think about a magic wand where learning was accessible for all. I had the great, wonderful experience of caring for my mother-in-law in her waning days here in Kelowna. And one of the things that happened was she got to a place where she had to be in a wheelchair. I got a whole new view of society by pushing her around in a wheelchair, which was right before my eyes forever, and I'd never seen it. I went to take her to the market, and I said, where is the parking spot? And they said, it's right there, and it's wide for you, but it had like 1-inch broken gravel on it. Well, we could not move the wheelchair through and the stories go on and on and on and on and on. But, a magic wand, learning and resources that are accessible for all. And I use the example of diverse abilities, but accessible means a lot of different things to a lot of people. It just doesn't mean the physical things you see. Of course, kids who are fed and families, and have a loving and caring family, not describing the family, but saying loving and caring, a society of hope and optimism where diversity is welcome and celebrated. We don't see that all the time now. And I would say, a magic wand, I'd say a society where adults are role models, where adults get along and support each other rather than these discourses of division. that we see. Like I look if you turn on the news today, you don't see adults as role models. At least that's not my experience. You see adults in these incredibly divisive conversations and at war and killing each other, right? And I think the adults in the school would have opportunities for their own learning, right? Like every adult in the school feels connected. They have their own warm collegial relationships, and they work as a team in support of the success of each student. And, and Michael Fullen and I are talking about this term connected autonomy, people feeling connected to something bigger than themselves, which would be like the Daniel Pink piece as well, right? Yet being autonomous to go do your good work, but feeling connected to something bigger than yourself.
Well, that's certainly the type of world I'd love to live in, and hopefully, brick by brick, step by step, we can build that. Last question, Jordan. What book, article, album would you recommend for the audience?
Oh, there's so much good stuff on there. What have I watched recently? I just watched this movie called The Holdovers. It's about a curmudgeonly teacher, Paul Giamatti, in a boys' private school, and it's a great. I really love him as an actor. I think that's a great movie. It's streamed on Netflix. To put in the plug there, I think it is. Also, there's a movie we watched recently called The Mountain Queen: The Summits of Laksa Sherpa. It's the story of incredible courage of a woman who lives in real poverty in Nepal, and she's a woman, she's a Sherpa, and she tries to carve out a life of climbing mountains. And her story of tenacity and overcoming substantial adversity is really worth it. A book I listen to Audible right now. I'm listening to quite a good little mystery called Listen for the Lie, and it's different in that it includes a podcast. And it's a mystery, and it's something a little different, and I'm really enjoying it. Yeah, Listen for the Lie.
That sounds fantastic. That sounds fantastic. Well, I'll make sure to link all this for the audience. Jordan, thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome. Okay, always a pleasure, and look forward to next time, Jason.
This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bukhari. Until next time.